Okay, so my name is Jeff, and I'm going to be talking about auto-generating forms in React using JSON. That sounds like maybe a cool topic, we'll see. What's really exciting about this is that it's powered by a language that I wrote. It's called MSON. So there's a lot more to it under the covers, but we'll stay in the superficial area for now, as far as form generation and React is concerned, and then maybe we'll have some time to kind of dig in a little bit afterwards. Before I get into this, when I speak, I like to have participation from the audience, if at all possible. So if there's something that pops into your mind and you just want to end up asking a question, please go for it. That's kind of the best way for me to engage. A little bit about me. I come from an entrepreneurial background. About 6 years ago, sold a company, very small potatoes as far as like what's concerned with deals that are done around here. But since then have moved into another startup. So now I am the director of software architecture for Knock. We are hiring, shameless plug. You can go to that website there. There's a number of positions for front end, back end, and a number of other exciting things. We make a CRM for property managers. It sounds like it's not very sexy, but there's a tremendous opportunity there. All I can say is that we're growing very quickly, closed Series A, have 10 million in funding, and are just hiring and hiring and hiring. So if you have any interest, check it out. We're currently looking for people that have a few years of experience, so that's kind of the bar right now. Other things, so before I joined on Knock, I created a programming language, like I was saying, called MSON. It was a fun project. It's all written actually in JS. And I can talk more about that, but that's a whole nother topic as far as the details. Also created something called Spiegel, which is a scalable replication layer for CouchDB. CouchDB, cool database, but not really used that much. Creator of Slouch, which is a JS client for CouchDB, and I also decided to create a database from scratch. You know, why the hell not? It works, but I abandoned it because the clustering part was going to take forever, and a community wasn't really forming around it. But good experience. Okay, my conclusion, creating forms is a pain in the ass. Okay, maybe you don't think so, maybe it's easy, you just plug into some library, but it takes way too much work, okay? Things that you have to worry about, right? So you have to worry about validation, your layout, your date time pickers, your multiple selects, your search selects, your conditional fields, collections, field mass, help text, rich text. I mean, you name it. There's a lot to it, especially if your site or your app is heavy on collecting content. It just takes a long time, and sometimes there's maybe a faster way of doing it, which I've got to show you. You can declare the structure of your form, right, and have the UI generate it for you. So yeah, declare your forms. Let the UI automatically render it for you. That sounds pretty good, right? Yeah. Right, yeah. Is that possible? Well, it is. So, idea, you have some JSON. You say, okay, in this case, I am naming my form. It's a component. MSON, this is based on the language, MSON, which can declare any type of component, but in this case, we're dealing with a form, so we're instantiating essentially a form component, and we're declaring fields. We're saying, okay, we want a text field for the name, it's required. We want an email field called email. Super simple, right? All right, so let's get into a little bit of a demo here. A creepy fox, it's always good. I think this is the right one. Yes, it is. Okay. So this is on Code Sandbox. I'm gonna share these slides afterwards in case somebody wants to play around with it. There's a number of examples if you go to the MSON repo as well. Simple example here, right? Requiring importing a bunch of things, and then there's a definition, which I'm going to get into, and then there's a simple React component that's declared right here. This is everything. And if you look at what's actually happening here, we are declaring a form, we have a heading, we actually have some nice markup in here, so it supports, or markdown rather. So it supports markdown. You can see how that's happening right here. We are declaring a person name field, which is going to give us a first name and last name. A birthday field. If you look, there's a date picker that comes up. It's kind of nice. It's all Material UI. It's all using extensions of Material UI as well. It's all baked in. Phone number, so we can do things where you can see a mass field there. It's kind of nice. And of course, we want a submit button, and we want a submit button that submits on enter. Just quickly, some things you can do really quickly if you want, just to kind of show you how this would work. If I want to change, I can say, okay, I want this to be on the same line as the phone. It hasn't refreshed. That's interesting. All right, something to look into. Okay. Not sure why it's not working. Not sure. I could hit refresh. I'm not going to bother. This should bring it on the next line. I think this is actually a code sandbox issue. Let's see. So what's happening, though, once we declare this definition, which is JSON? Afterwards, all we're simply doing is rendering a component. This is included via the MSON React. So the way that MSON works is that there's a core library which handles a lot of the guts of what's going on as far as rendering JS into actual JavaScript components. The MSON React layer is the layer that actually does the UI rendering. So it kind of works in tandem with that. The idea is that you could pretty easily write a MSON React layer. You could write a MSON Vue layer. You could have a MSON React Bootstrap layer if you wanted to. It's interchangeable. You don't need the core necessarily to be updated for that type of thing. But here we're using React. That's what this talk is about. So we declare a component. We pass in a definition. We say on submit. Submit is an event, and also there's a handler that's generated based on this button. Because we have a name of submit here, it's simply going to create a handler for us. And we can alert essentially the values that are in the form, right? So if we look very quickly, super basic, if I were to do something like, let's see, submit, you'll see, okay, alert. Basic, right? Not super impressive right now. We're just kind of getting started. But you can see maybe the power of what we're dealing with here, right? Especially if you're thinking about forms that maybe change dynamically. Start visualizing from that perspective. Okay. Oh yeah, please.
Does the component on that need the React component, the component in the JSON? Is that like a React component somewhere that it's going to render?
This one right here?
No, up in the JSON definition. You have component.
Yes. Oh, okay. So this is somewhat unfortunate in the sense that it's called component and React uses components. Component here is just meant to be that MSON, the underlying technology, considers almost every single object to be a component. So this is just a convention that says, I want to use or instantiate a form component. You can also instantiate like a menu, you can instantiate like a snack bar. I mean, there's a lot of different components. It basically mimics the environment that is available with Material UI. But what's nice here is that this is kind of like a smart component that figures out what the definition is and then can render it accordingly. You can also specify it specifically, but you don't need to do that. Good question. Okay. So let's look at the second example here. So let's turn it up just a little bit. Okay. So in this example, we have another definition. We once again have some markdown. We are declaring some fields. We have required fields. You can see we've added some like help text, for example. That's nice. It comes right in. It's kind of the convention that's available in Material UI. We have a couple fields in here, and we now have this new thing called the validators. The validators is essentially a way of applying extra validation logic to the fields. By default, if you declare an email field, then obviously it should be in the format of an email. But what if you want to apply some extra validation logic in there? Well, the way that it works is leveraging essentially the query language built into MongoDB, which if you're not familiar with it, it's actually a query language which is now supported by MongoDB, supported by CouchDB, and there's actually an open source library called Sift as well. I believe there are other implementations as well, but the nice thing is that you can see right here that you're essentially declaring a way of finding or identifying an error, which this is a simple example. There are ones where you can say not equals to, you can use regular expressions, you can have entire like or, and you name it. It really provides this very powerful querying language at your disposal. So in this particular example, we're saying if the field value is equal to nope, then I want it to actually bark. This is for the email, so if I were to do something like this, you'll see that it tells you right away that there's an error. And I probably should zoom in a little bit. Is that a little easier to see? Okay. Okay, so what's happening in the React part? We have a component still, we have a definition. What we're doing here is that if you noticed when this first loaded, it actually loaded some data. You can think of this kind of like if you have a form that's going to load some data from an API. It could be a RESTful API, it could be a GraphQL API, you name it, it's up to you. It's going to run this on mount, very similar to how you'd structure in the lifecycle of on mount or component did mount, right? Here we're going to just set the values, so you can imagine this coming from some other source. Clearing the form, there's functions that you can execute on the component, such as reset, so I can hit that and it resets. And then on submit, we're doing something a little bit more. We're gonna console log it, whatever, it could go to an API, no big deal. So in this case, for example, we may have some extra validation logic, right? For example, we, in this case, said that we don't want a certain value to be set, but sometimes we may need to reach out to a database and get that value. So we may need to make some sort of query first, and you can simulate that here. You can see we're saying if the value of this is equal to, take in that example, then report an error. So what's nice is that under the covers, what's happening is that we have a pub sub type of setup here. Is it taken? Right, so if I hit submit, oh, I gotta enter in some other values because it's barking about that first. You can see it's already in use. So essentially it's come in here, it's run this code. Simulation would be, it could hit the database, it could validate it, and then it fails in that. So it's not just a validation that happens in the browser, but you can also have a validation that happens in the background as well, in your backend. All right, any questions so far? No, pretty simple stuff, I guess. Yeah, please.
How do you handle
nested object? Yeah, so there are constructs for things such as a record list. At the end, I can kind of go into some of the fields. There's about 30 of them or so. And there's a concept of a record list, which is essentially a collection. And so you can define that. You can also say, that's if you have n number of items nested. If you want just one, you can call a form field, which essentially you can define a form as a nested entry as well. And the way it would appear as far as the values is that whatever you name this nested object, it would be that name dot whatever the fields are. So you get an automatic kind of nested value in there. It's a great question. Okay, so what is this MSON thing, right? What is this thing that's powering the whole thing? Well, MSON is a play on the word JSON, or at least the acronym. It's sort of roughly stands for Model Script Object Notation. Really, it's just kind of a witty way, like you're building stuff and you're declaring it, right? Right? It's acronym, yeah.
Backronym.
Oh, backronym, yeah. That's good. What is the idea behind it? We take a step back. So I've shown you forms, and I think there's a lot of application there, especially if you're trying to come up with a quick prototype. You don't want to worry about creating all of the moving pieces. But really, what this is about is the dream of allowing anyone to create software visually. So it's about creating a declarative language where you can imagine a UI, somebody comes in and can declare every aspect of it. It's not just a form, like Google Forms, whatever the case is. It's not just like a smart spreadsheet, like Airtable or like Smartsheet. It's something that is got more meat to it. The challenge there is that if you were to try to think about how you would implement complicated logic, it'd be difficult to program that visually, but if you have it in a declarative way, and I'll show you in a little bit, like kind of an example, then it's fairly easy to create a UI that can generate it, and then fairly easy to create a UI that can consume it as well. So create a language that can be easily manipulated by a UI. And here's kind of a basic example if you look at it from a kind of a low-level development standpoint. You have your imperative code on the left, right? We're essentially trying to pick out the even entries or elements in this array, okay? And then you have your declarative. Also kind of sometimes in this case referred to sort of as functional programming. I'm kind of using that liberally, but the point is that in this case, we are declaring a filter and we're saying, what are we going to filter by? You can see very quickly that you get right down to the meat of what it's actually doing. And if you think about the extension of this, if you declare what you're trying to do, the logic, the business logic in like JSON, you can really get quite far as being able to generate it and also then consume it and be able to modify it. So MSON is a declarative language with the capabilities of an object-oriented language. That's kind of funky. It's a subset of JSON. Okay, so basically everything that you declare is JSON, but not all JSON is MSON. So there are specific rules as to what you declare, which is actually defined by the MSON itself. So the way that works, I'm not sure if anybody has used JSON schema before, but there's essentially a way of declaring the schema for the different components, and then if you don't define it correctly, then it will end up barking at you. So there's a very strict way of defining these particular components. And the compiler is written in JS and it's framework agnostic. The MSON React layer is particular to React and to Material UI, but the core, which is where the bulk of the logic is completely just JS and doesn't care. It uses pub/sub. There's no Redux. There's nothing that is particularly opinionated about anything. It's pretty bare bones. Some of the language features, I don't really have time to go into all of this. There's a couple of blog posts that I've written about this, and definitely there's a deep dive into all of these constructs on the repo. But there's components, validators, events, and listeners. So like I said before, components, you can kind of structure anything as a component. A component can be composed of other components. Validators are those special MongoDB-like definitions that you can make that say, okay, I need to check a data in a certain way. The events and listeners, essentially anytime anything is done with any of these components, an event is emitted, and then you can define listeners that listen to it and then respond accordingly. Pretty basic flow. It has access control as well. So you can do things like say, okay, I have a data object, let's say it's first name, last name, and email address. I only want certain users to be able to access the first name and last name, and then others to be able to access the email address. You can actually do that kind of partitioning as well. That's all baked right into how you declare essentially the access to the component. There's inheritance, so components can inherit others. You can think of, like, so let's say you have a component, let's go back to the name or contact. You can have first name, last name, email address. You may have one that then adds a phone number to it or so forth, so you can do that kind of nice reusable design. There's template parameters, so you can declare a component that ends up having a dynamic field, if you will. So it could be like maybe the label changes based on what you declare it, what you pass in, some functionality, error checking, you name it. It's all done via a pretty standard handlebar templating language. There's composition and factories. And there's aggregate components. So there's a whole bunch of components like a record list, which say, like, if you want to have a component that can handle CRUD, like the entire, like all CRUD operations, you can just say, here's my object, go ahead, you handle all CRUD. And then I want to shut down deleting if I'm a certain type of user, you can do that. I want it to store, and I'll show you an example in a little bit. I want to store in Firebase, you can do that. I want to store in local storage, you can do that. schemas and self-documenting, so you can declare the structure of the different. Yeah, thanks. You can declare the schema in actually MSON or MSON. This is funny. I don't even know how to say my own thing. But the self-documenting allows you to then have elements like UIs, which I can show you as a form builder, which gives you the information on each component, and it pulls right in from whatever the definition is. Okay, so basic app. All right, so let's take it up a notch. So I talked about forms. What if I want an entire app to be written in JSON, right? Or JSON, there you go. Technically, actually, the creator of JSON was Douglas Crockford, I believe, and he called it JSON, but most people call it JSON, so that's why I have a hard time going back and forth, just to give you that background. So here we have a definition, and it's a little bit nasty because we got a bunch of nested pieces here. You can split out the nested pieces into their own kind of namespaces, but for the sake of brevity here, it's all in just one. Essentially, we have a main component called an app. We have a menu that's defined. We have a root path. We have a contacts component, which has a record list, which was kind of what I was talking about before. We have a factory, which generates essentially a contact. Seems like there's a bunch of stuff going on here, but the root is that all I really care about, is defining this field here, which is the name field. The rest of this is kind of boilerplate-y, and you can imagine a UI could generate this for you pretty quickly. And all I'm saying then is that I want this to persist to local storage, right? So as you can see, I have this stored in local storage. I get some nice, easy things, like I have a menu that comes in, all material UI. I can actually do some searching. It's all baked in. Things like sorting, you can do that. I can do like soft deletes, and I can have them appear in this case. You have your basic CRUD operations as well, being able to create and whatnot. But you get a lot for free, and then what you can do here is that you can customize any of this. All of it is just JS. So you can imagine that, especially for anybody kind of trying to rapidly prototype something, they could just declare it quickly and get a feel for how it would be. If they want to go in later, you can actually split out all the CRUD operations. You can actually go in and create your own custom components too. It's just JS. The way the compiler works is not really a compiler. It's not really a transpiler. It's really like an instantiator. Basically, each component has a JavaScript representation. It takes the JSON and it essentially instantiates the JavaScript object. And so you can, whatever you can do in JavaScript, you can do in MSON. It's really that simple, which means that also it works, anywhere that JavaScript works. Let's see. How am I doing on time?
Good.
Yeah, how much more time do I have?
5 to 6 minutes.
6 minutes, sweet. All right. Okay, so there's no way that I could just be like, use MSON, like don't use anything else. I think MSON has its applications. I think it's a very early technology. I do see a lot of benefit, especially in the space of people that are not necessarily developers, being able to pick something up, and kind of like how everyone can use a spreadsheet. Everyone maybe at some point will be able to develop an app, like a basic one, just to help them with their workflow. I think that is really kind of the promise. If you're looking to be a little more hands-on, there's a couple projects that are sort of in this space that I'm sure probably most people here are familiar with. There's something called JSON schema form, which is based on JSON schema. You declare your form and then generates in a similar way. The problem with that is that, one, it's JSON schema really declares the structure, or not the structure, but the validation rules. And it's really good for that. If you've ever had a chance where you're writing like a backend API and you want to validate like the input, like it's killer for that, especially across platform or across language. But for declaring forms, it's kind of like a separate, or structures, it's kind of like a separate ecosystem. And then you have to kind of declare it, you have to kind of declare UI. There's a bunch of pieces in it. So the reason why I didn't personally build on top of this is that I wanted a single language that does both the validation and also the declaration for the UI, just because I didn't see that benefit of having two separate ones. And then for the form side, there's a bunch of different tools that you can use, especially in React, but Formic is pretty awesome. I highly recommend it if you haven't checked it out. I think both these projects, you get a lot of mileage with it. That being said, I like MSON. I like the idea behind it. If you get a chance to play with it, please do. Contribute. It's at 253 stars, so it's not that high on GitHub, but it's growing. People are interested. It's a cool, fun little project. Who knows? Let's see. Any questions? And if there's any more time, I can also kind of show some more stuff. But anything anybody's curious about.
Are you guys using this at Knowledge?
We are not.
Okay.
Yeah. So Knock was built about 5 years ago initially, and I would say for a company like Knock, where we have enough developers to kind of specialize, that this is probably less effective. I think where you might get a lot of mileage is with an individual, maybe, or a team that is kind of rapidly prototyping something and then wants to dive in deeper. So it may be like an intermediate tool, if you will. Or if you're somebody that's not a developer, I think it could be pretty awesome because you could stand up something pretty quickly. Yeah.
Do you have to use Material UI? Like, do you have the option of ejecting
It's a
it?
great question. So for now, yes, because the only rendering layer that's available is MSON React. But that being said, the MSON React code is about maybe 5% of the entire code base. So I've already had people that have been like, oh, I want it in Vue, I want it in, they said Bootstrap, Semantic UI. Just kind of waiting for people to maybe throw some contributions, but that's not the way open source works. You need to kind of foster it. I personally don't have too much time for it, so it's kind of an organic approach. I would love to see that happen. I think there is a lot of benefit to it. But yes, currently I chose Material UI because Material UI is probably the most popular framework that's out there. Any questions?
For the custom MSON components, can you declare your own component?
Definitely.
Okay, and then can you also edit the ones that exist already? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so all the components, so to declare your own, you can simply kind of base it off of a base component, which is already in the library, which doesn't really do much. It's just basically like a pub sub wrapper that allows you to kind of subscribe to different events. So then on top of that, you could put anything in there. You could even put Redux in there. I mean, you name it. You could do whatever you want to kind of layer into there. As far as changing, so if you were to say wanted to change the default functionality of what already exists, I'd recommend trying to go with kind of the tunable options that are in there. But if not, you can just essentially use a higher order component or something of that nature to kind of extend the functionality if you wanted to. And it's all open source, so you could also hack the hell out of it if you want. It's not really difficult code, to be honest. Any other questions? Yeah.
You say that you want people to be able to do this in a visual way. How hard do you think this is? Has the hard work been done, or is the hard work to come for that project?
That's a great question. So let's take a look at kind of where it is right now, and maybe it'll help you visualize. Simple app. This entire app right here is like a demo app. It's all written in MSON. There's no JavaScript in there, right? And specifically for what you're saying, I'll just show you a couple small things. Like I was saying before, you can wire up Firebase right in there. So this whole list is with Firebase. So you get the cool benefits of somebody else editing, and it will automatically in real time update on your screen as you would expect. Nothing super fancy these days. But for the generation, there's a form builder component that allows you to essentially be able to modify the form. This can be extended to be able to generate other components, but for right now, this is kind of what I've been playing around with. So you could do things like, let's add a field. Let's say you want an address field. You can define what it is, and a label, required, full width. There's a number of options in here, and then you can do things like it uses. I can't remember the name of the library now. It's a drag and drop library, which is really popular. But sorry.
React drag and drop?
Yeah, I think it's React drag and drop, but don't quote me on that. You got to talk to the person that wrote this thing. But then you can see, for example, it does a preview right here. I've been fooling around with a new version that actually will export the JSON, so that you'll be able to export it and then import it. So it's kind of like a nice little way of saving it and then putting it back in. Still not done yet. There's a lot of work to be done. But if you can visualize what's kind of nice about this, is that you see all these fields that are popping up right here, and even the fact that there's help. This is all defined in the component itself. So once you define a component, it's like self-documenting. Conceptually, the UI should be able to just read that and allow you to provide some input on the different options that you have. Also behind the scenes, something I've been working on, because long-term vision, this probably won't go anywhere unless you have a corporate entity behind it. It's just kind of the way things are. So I've been working on kind of a managed service layer, which is more just for fun right now, which essentially uses GraphQL, and it uses right now, it uses MySQL, but it uses like SQLize, so it ends up providing a backend that automatically gets generated from the MSON, right? So you declare it in one place, and then automatically you have a backend that's there at your disposal. But that whole piece can be extracted as well, or abstracted in the sense that you could go in and out of almost any type of database, and the structure of it can also be interchangeable. Right now it's using kind of a home-baked authentication layer, but you could easily like plug into something like Cognito or something else like that. Yeah. So I think I'm out of time. Maybe one more question if anybody has it. Yeah, last one.
So React is pretty declarative already, and obviously this is just building you a React, set of components. Would it be that hard to just export the React that this is building as an app, and then be able to enhance that? So prototype in this, and then export the app that this is prototyping, so that you can enhance it with like.
It's a good idea.
More complete, like for a full team.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I think you'd end up running into a bunch of logic that's kind of like boilerplatey, where you'd be.
I mean, this is building boilerplate for you.
Yeah, I'll have to ponder that a little bit, but I would think that you would still need a core set of like components that it would rely on, and I don't know what the value of that would be. I think I could definitely see some value. I mean, this pattern has been kind of used in many places where you generate something in the UI and then generates code. Right. The problem with that is that you can't go back to the UI afterwards because you've kind of gone into your imperative code. So I think it's definitely useful, but the test of time is that people don't tend to use these things too much. And I think maybe somewhere where I see the benefit is still keeping it in that declarative syntax. But I think it's a great idea, for sure. If you want to work on that, please, let's do it.
Cool. All right.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.